guys, it's Courtney. Today we're going to be making a card using a ton of different Lawn Fawn stamp sets, and I'm just using one or two images from each one. I'm using Oh Snap, Christmas Dreams, Winter Village, Ready Set Snow, and Holiday Helpers. So I'm starting off with a piece of Neenah Solar White cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and you can see that I have all of the images that I plan on using on my card stamped out on a piece of full stick Post-it. And I'm taking 3 of these sheets. So that way I only have to cut these out once and I have 3 masks. So I'm just going to turn my paper with my left hand and keep my scissors pretty straight with my right hand. And I cut all of my little masks and put them aside. They're not going to be perfect and they don't need to be for this technique. For the little snowmen, their hands, their stick arms or whatever, I just cut around them so that I still had a mask and I can always fix up any areas with a Copic Safe pen later. So I wanted to make this look like I had a whole pile of everything to do with Christmas. So I'm using Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because I will be Copic coloring all of my images, and I'm just stamping one at a time. So I'm just kind of mixing and matching, not really worried about my placement. I pretty much stick to the larger images first, and then I'll fill in any gaps or smaller areas with the smaller images, and I'm masking each time I go. Now, it doesn't matter if your masks are perfect. When you are cutting out multiple masks at one time with these full stick Post-it notes, the ones below the one that actually has the stamped image is not going to be perfect. As careful as you are, they do shift around a little bit, so you will see that some of these masks aren't perfect, but that's okay. Like I said, we can always go back in with a Copic Safe pen and fill in any gaps or any errors before we start our coloring. So as you can see, I'm just kind of working my way up. My plan is to make it look like they're kind of falling from the top and they're in a big pile at the bottom. So I'm starting at the bottom and kind of working maybe about 2/3 away across the card. And then as I get higher up, I'll keep everything kind of closer together and closer to the left-hand side. This looks like it takes longer than it does. You don't even need to have 3 masks for each of these. It depends on how many images you have and how much of the card panel you want to fill up. But I ended up not even using all 3 masks for each image because once I was done with a specific area, I could just move that mask and reuse it. You won't want to reuse it too many times though. So if you only have 1 mask and you use that image 5 or 6 times, you may want to grab a new mask, especially with the full stick Post-it notes. They tend to, the ink tends to seep through if you stamp on it too many times or do too much ink blending on it. So this little candy cane, I did not bother to cut a mask out. It was way too teeny tiny, and I figured I did want to use it in the card, but I'm just using that as a filler, I guess, for any areas that maybe need something but need something pretty tiny, or to extend any areas of my little pile of Christmas things that I need to fill in. And now you can see that sometimes I kind of hesitate as to where I want to stamp things. Any Copic Safe ink or any ink at all is going to dry on your stamp. So if you take too long to decide, you may not get a very crisp image. That's okay, because we're going to have to go back in with our Copic Safe pen anyway, so I'll just go over those same lines from the stamped image if I didn't get a great impression. So as you can see, I'm almost done here, and this is kind of like one of those adult coloring books. This is what it kind of reminds me of. It's just a whole lot of coloring, and it's fun. It's really fun to do. It's relaxing. You can kind of just take some markers or pencils or whatever your medium is of choice and just color away. So once all of my stamping was done, I will go ahead and remove my masks and take my Copic Safe pen. I use a EK Success journaling pen, and I'm just going to fix up those areas that, especially around the snowman's arms, my image that I stamped next to it isn't really whole because I had to mask out a larger area than the arm actually took up. So I'll just fix those areas up and we'll move right into the Copic coloring. So I started with this little gingerbread man, and I'm just going to show you one of each object, I guess. Starting off with my lightest color, and I'm just filling in the entire area, and then I'm just going to go around the edges with my darkest color. This shading for this particular image is going to be different than most other images just because I want my lightest area to be right in the center. It's a cookie, so the darkest areas would be on the outer edges. Blending that out with my 2 midtones and just leaving the highlight right there in the center, mainly on his face and his little body. Next, we'll move on to the snowmen, and I'm just doing a little bit of shading on the snowman's body. I want these to appear white, but I am doing just a little bit of shading underneath their scarves and hats with the C3, and I'll flick that out with the C1 and fade that off to white. I took a YR marker, and it honestly doesn't even matter which one you use. I didn't do any shading for their little carrot noses. I just filled those in solid. Next, we'll move on to the little teddy bear. I couldn't think of the word. Filling in the entire area again with the lightest color, and I'm using my E50s here. I'm just doing a little bit of shading on either side of his face, underneath his little chin, and above his little feet. If any object is laying underneath another, that would also create a shadow, so just keep that in mind, especially if you plan on using colors that are similar to one another or the same. Like I'm going to use a whole lot of red and green here, so I want to make sure that I do create shadows for any object that's laying under another. For the trees, I am using a YG and a G combination, and I'm just putting in some shading on the top and underneath each of these little sections of the trees, and just using small little flick lines to kind of create a little bit of texture. And then I'll blend that out with that YG03, and I'm going to go over the entire area just to kind of lighten everything up because the other ones are G markers. So I'm filling in just the trunk of the tree solid with that E59, and then I'll move on to some yellows. And I'm going to color some of the presents and one of the rolls of wrapping paper with my yellows. Again, starting off with my lightest color and just mapping out my darkest areas. I'm going to color some of the presents as well as some of the little ribbons on the presents and bows. My darkest color is a Y38, which is more of an orange than it is a yellow, but it does blend nicely with the rest of the Y markers. So you can always use an orange or a YR marker to do your shading for any yellow objects. You can also use some of the E markers as well, but I wanted to kind of keep this nice and bright, so I stuck to the Ys. So I'm just kind of randomly coloring some of these presents here. They're going to be yellow, red, and green. So I'm just kind of doing this randomly. I don't really have a plan. I'm also going to color one of the rolls of wrapping paper with this same combination. And what I want this to appear like, as if it's kind of has some movement. So I'm going to do my shading on the roll itself. It would have shading on either side because it's a round object. And for the part that's kind of sticking out, I'm going to do shading on both sides as well. And this will make it appear that it's kind of wavy a little bit, if that makes sense. And it just gives any object a little bit of movement by keeping your highlight in an area that you might not necessarily think to keep your highlight in. But again, just using that same yellow combination or Y combination that I used for the rest of the presents. And we'll move on to the other green combination that I'm going to be using, and I'm going to be using this throughout the entire card. And this is one of my go-to green combinations. Going to just show you this one roll of wrapping paper just so that you can kind of see the colors that I'm using. But I also colored some of the presents, colored them the same way as far as the shading goes as we did with the yellow ones, but obviously this green combination. I also colored some of the hats and the scarves of the snowmen as well. Again, just keeping my highlight in the center of this roll of the wrapping paper. One end is a round object and the other, I just want to create that movement. Next, we'll move on to the red combination, and as always, this is my go-to red combination, and this is where my disaster began. So I just refilled this marker, and this is the lightest color in R22, and my marker blobbed. And of course it blobbed on a white object. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take out my scrap piece of paper here, because this will seep through the bottom of your card panel. Just gonna take my colorless blender and kind of just dab it and leave it there in certain areas, and move that to the next area and just kind of hold it in place. You'll have to do this a few times, but you'll want to make sure that it's dry in between. So I'm going to go on and I'm going to color some of the objects that I planned on coloring red. And then I'm going to kind of go back and forth, add a little bit more colorless blender, hold it in place, let it dry, color a few more things, and keep going back and forth until I'm able to lift up at least most of the color. Out of all the colors to do this, of course, it's an R marker, the hardest one to get up, but I was able to manage to get most of it anyway. So for the shading for the scarf on the snowman here, I'm just putting a little bit of shading on either side, as well as the little parts of the scarf, the ends of the scarf that are hanging down. For the hat, just doing a little bit of shading on the top and the bottom. And here I'm just going back, adding a little bit more of that colorless blender. You can see how it soaks right through the back of your card panel onto that scrap piece of paper. So you want to make sure that you're working on something. You can work on a paper towel, anything, whatever's easiest for you. For the little stockings, I'm just doing a little bit of shading on the left-hand side. Really no reason for it. I just decided the left-hand side would have the shading, using that same red combination. And again, going back, making sure that my paper's dry before I add more colorless blender. You can tell if it's dry if it's not cold. If it's cold to the touch, it's not dry. I'm adding a whole lot of colorless blender here, and it's alcohol, so it will dry quickly, but not immediately. So one final time, I'm gonna go in with that colorless blender, and then I figured this is probably the best I'm gonna get it. And I'm going to add my C3 and my C1 right to that same area. Now, when you add your C1 especially, the C1 is such a light color, you can kind of think of it as it having colorless blender in it, in the mixture, I guess. So any really light color is going to pick up darker colors. So I figured this was the best I was going to be able to get with the colorless blender. So the C1 will continue to pick up a little bit of the red that's left behind. It still ended up having a little bit of a pink shade to it, but it is what it is. I did all that masking and I got that far with the coloring, and I wasn't going to start over. Once everything was complete, I took my white gel pen just to add a few details to some of the objects. I added the little buttons back onto the little gingerbread man, and I added some reflections on some random objects. Also added some polka dots because that's the easiest thing to add with a gel pen. And I also added some diagonal stripes to this little roll of wrapping paper. I just wanted to make sure, especially the larger objects like the wrapping paper, I didn't want them to blend in with all of the objects, the other objects that are the same color. So before I moved on, I kind of just went over, took a quick look to make sure I didn't miss anything. When there's so many objects and so many teeny tiny objects, it's very easy to miss something. So just make sure that you have all of your objects colored. I tend to miss things sometimes, especially when I have so much going on. Next, I took a sentiment from the Holiday Helper stamp set and lined that up onto my acrylic block. Stamped that off on a piece of scrap paper just to make sure it was lined up before stamping it on my card panel with my VersaFine Onyx Black ink. And last, I'll take my Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen just to add some shimmer to some random objects, primarily the wrapping paper rolls, because like I said, I just didn't want them to blend in with all of the other things. But that is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.